Yeah, thanks so much. Welcome, everyone here. It's good to be in Port Burwell and everybody watching online. We got a lot of material to cover today, so we're going to do our best. We put an agenda up on the screen. I'll quickly take you through the topics that we will be discussing. We'll be looking at the secular versus biblical perspective with respect to how we should manage our money. And then we'll move into financial deceptions that we need to be aware of that are evident in our culture today. And then we're going to give you some practical steps to hopefully reduce and eventually help you get out of debt. And that will move us into the budgeting session. And we'll be looking at a video from Tom. He'll take us through the Copland budgeting system. And then we're going to look at dealing with inflation and high interest rates, something that we're all, I think, struggling with these days, unfortunately, with the rise in the interest rates, especially over the last several months. And lastly, we'll be looking at discerning God's will through your relationship with Christ, which is probably the most important out of all of these topics here. So just before we jump into the material, I would like to say just a very quick prayer, if that's okay. I think we can never get enough prayer. Lord, I just want to thank you so much for bringing us together here today to study your word on finances. And Lord, I just pray that you help each and every one of us understand your will and how we are to manage the money that you have entrusted to us. Lord, I pray that you guide our discussion today and help us to be respectful of each other's comments and opinions. And Lord, I just ask that I just want to thank Tom for his commitment to teaching your word, and I pray that you give him spiritual discernment to move this ministry forward for your ultimate glory, Lord. Thank you. We ask this in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Thank you. Okay, so let's get into our first topic, which is, again, looking at the secular versus the biblical perspective of how we are to manage money. And it's a really important distinction. I've just got a couple of questions up on the screen here. Do you think there is a difference between a secular perspective and a biblical perspective on managing money and material things? And then a secondary question, do you think Christians ever fall into the secular mindset? And I think it's fairly obvious. We know the answer to the first question is yes. There absolutely is a difference between the way a secular person kind of approaches the management of money as opposed to a biblical steward. The concern is the second question, right? Unfortunately, even Christians, we fall into this secular mindset. And generally, it's because we unknowingly violate biblical principles. Like we're just not aware. I was the same 15 years ago, even though I had a background in finance. Until I took Tom's course, I was not aware of all the biblical principles that the Lord has provided to us. So that's what we want to do today. Really, we want to get into God's word and start to learn some of these principles so that we can eventually apply them, right, to our own personal lives and our own financial situations. So we have a recommended memory verse for this particular session. We try and do that for each of them because it's a good way for us to start to change our mindset, and that's what Romans 12:2 essentially focuses on. Do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds, right? So that by testing you may discern what is the will of God and what is good and acceptable and perfect. That's really, I think, our goal today, is that we gradually start to change our mindset with respect to how we manage money. Okay, so we're going to go through a number of different comparisons between the biblical and the secular mindset. So one thing we found that's helpful to some people is if you want to just prayerfully ask the Lord as we go through these different comparisons to bring anything to your attention that you might be struggling with, that you might need to address. You can also do this on your own after the session. I find is also helpful if you have some quiet time to yourself. Just revisit some of these slides. Everybody, I think, has the handouts, so you can always do that again on your own as well. And just prayerfully ask the Lord to bring anything that you might be struggling with to your attention, because a lot of times we don't even realize that we're violating some of these biblical principles. Okay. So the first comparison is the secular person believes that we own our material resources, whereas a biblical steward acknowledges that God owns everything, and we are simply managers, right, of what God has entrusted to us. 1 Timothy 6, 7, we brought nothing into this world, we can take nothing out of it. And Psalms 24, 1 and 2, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, for he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. So this is a very important distinction. I know many of us are familiar with the principle of stewardship, but I think if we're honest with each other, with one another, it's much easier to say than to live out, right? It's difficult, especially in the culture today, right, where we're really encouraged and pushed towards materialism, right? And many people even worship materialism. They, if we're not worshiping God, we're worshiping something else. And so it's important for us to understand that we are accountable to the Lord, right? We think of stewardship, we think of accountability. And we need, in order to be accountable and to manage money wisely in accordance with God's will, we need to understand some of these biblical principles. With respect to the secular mindset, what I kind of find interesting, where, most think that, I get it, we work hard for our money and we purchase things with our hard-earned money, so we believe it's ours. But it's interesting because today in our culture, what most don't realize is, even if they don't believe in God, and that's fine, that God owns everything, the majority of people, unfortunately today, purchase assets, whether it's their home or a major asset, mostly on debt, right? So realistically, they don't own it, right? If you purchase a home for $1 million and you have an $800,000 mortgage, your name might be on that deed, but the bank really owns that house, because if you don't make your mortgage payments, they can come and take your house away. Similar with an automobile. Most people either finance or lease their automobiles these days, right? If you miss your payments, they're going to come and take your vehicle. So this mindset that, we own our material possessions is not really true, because most people only are able to purchase things with excessive debt, right? So what we want to just take away from this is we just want to make sure that we are managing our money in a manner that's consistent with God's will. That's the key. Okay, so the second comparison, number 2, the secular person looks to the self and wisdom of the world for direction, whereas the biblical steward looks to God and his word for direction in using financial resources. Like James 1:5, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Now this is interesting, and I appreciate this can be challenging, because in the world that we live in today, we have so much information at our fingertips, right? And people can become somewhat prideful because we can figure most things out on our own because we have the information available to us. But I think if we're honest and we look and see what's going on in this world, I think we're probably suffering from information overload, and people can't navigate through all the information to figure out what's actually true. What we as Christians need to do is rely on the Lord, right, for wisdom. I mean, I don't know about everyone else, but I find that as I get older, the more knowledge I appear to gain, or wisdom, the more I realize how much I don't know, right? Really, if we're honest with one another. So spiritual discernment is so important, right? I was watching a sermon this past week from Dr. Charles Stanley. He's with In Touch Ministries, and I quite like him. And he was speaking to this, the issue of spiritual discernment, how important it is for Christians to really seek spiritual discernment from the Lord before we make any decisions in life. And it was interesting because somebody asked him a question, essentially said, are you trying to tell me that when I go to the shopping mall, I should be asking the Lord where I should be spending my money? And he answered something along the lines of, well, when you get your bill at the end of the month, you will have wished you'd asked the Lord where to spend your money, right? And isn't that true, right? I mean, many of us, the Christmas season is coming upon us. We go out and we spend to our heart's content, and then, you get your bill in January and we wonder, how we spent all this money, instead of going to the Lord and asking him for direction as how to spend the money that he's entrusted to us. Okay, and again, I appreciate it's a difficult concept for us, for many people to accept, because again, we can become somewhat prideful, especially in this culture today. But it's just really important for us to stay focused and seek God's wisdom. All right. So next, number 3, secular person gives God and his work the leftovers, which are usually small, and the biblical steward gives the first fruits to God's work. 2 Corinthians 9, 6, and 7. Remember this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And this is the important part. Each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And I can appreciate that the concept of giving is a sensitive one, the issue of giving. Just a few things that I would just kind of comment on. We are under grace, right? And the Lord knows our individual financial situations. If you take a single parent who's struggling to make ends meet and gives 2 or 3% of his or her income to the Lord's work, the Lord will probably look upon that as sacrificial giving compared to somebody who might be giving 10% but are very wealthy and might be able to give 20% or 30%. I mean, Tom has told us he has many clients who give more than 30 or 40% of their income because they've been very blessed by the Lord, right? So I think we just don't want to be, some people get burdened by the 10%, and I don't want to preach on that. I think it's something we need to bring before the Lord in prayer. And keep in mind, the Lord does bless, right? Whatever giving. And there will be times in our life when maybe we can only give 2 or 3%. There might be other times when we can give 10 or 20%. So we should just keep that in mind. And the Lord does promise to bless us, right? In Luke 6:38, give and it shall be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. The one thing to keep in mind is that the Lord may not bless us in the manner in which we want to be blessed, right? Most people think of monetary blessings, but it could very well be in good health. And given what we've gone through the last 2.5 years, I think a lot of people would trade in some money for good health. So it could also be a healthy relationship or a job opportunity. So just something to keep in mind when it comes to giving. So number 4, a secular person is generally discontent with present level of income, always wants more. And the biblical steward is generally content with God's provision. Now we're going to talk a lot about contentment today, because contentment, we feel is the key in being able to live out a lot of these principles that we're going to talk about. And many years ago, I came across this kind of definition for contentment, which kind of resonated with me. And it goes something like this: contentment is not the fulfillment of the things we want, but the realization of how much we already have, right? So contentment is not the fulfillment of the things we want or desire, but the realization of how much we really have, right? And, we need to have an attitude of gratitude, right? And that doesn't mean that we cannot strive for more. A lot of people, misinterpret contentment that way. And I believe what it means is that we should be content with what the Lord has provided to us in this particular season in our life, right? We can strive for more. For example, if you take a family that wants to purchase a larger home, have a growing family, there's nothing wrong with that as long as we do that within God's will and God's timing. The problem is when we get ahead of God's will and timing, that's when we get, into problematic situations, especially financially. So, I'll just say about contentment again. We'll touch on it again later on, but it's absolutely key in helping us to apply and live out a lot of these biblical financial principles. Okay, so number 5, a secular person struggles with fear of the future or fear of losing assets, whereas the biblical steward puts God first and trusts God to provide for needs. So Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is a powerful verse, right? Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. We need to put our trust in the Lord. We cannot predict the future. There's many people, just from my own personal experience, I used to work in a bank many years ago, and we used to help our clients with their investment portfolios. And many of them were quite wealthy, and I usually work with an investment specialist because I'm not a specialist in this area. And everything, is, even though you lay everything out for them, they go over their risk tolerance and their time horizon and their investment objectives. everything is fine as long as the investments are doing well. But once the economy or the stock market takes a downturn, everybody starts to get stressed out and anxious. And that's when the phone calls come and people start wondering, what's going on, and they're looking for answers. I mean, we need to understand that, we can't predict the future. None of us can predict the future. And we shouldn't really worry about the future because we know who holds the future in the palm of his hand, right? So we need to just trust the Lord for our needs. And if we are confident that we're walking in the Lord's will, and we're carrying out his purpose for our life, then we shouldn't worry about the future consequences. There's another quote from Charles Stanley, which I like. He says, look, just trust God and leave all the consequences to him, right? We can't we can't figure out what all the consequences are going to be, but if we're walking in the Lord's will, he'll deal with the consequences for us. So that's the key there. And the sixth comparison is the secular person believes we are accountable to no one, and we can do with our money as we wish, and the biblical steward believes we are accountable to God for how we use the money that God has entrusted to us. And this goes hand in hand with stewardship, right? Stewardship really equals accountability. And it can be a difficult concept to grasp in this day and age, but it will go a long ways, and it can also help you in the area of contentment as well. If we learn to just, be accountable to the Lord and be grateful for what we have, we don't fall into many temptations that way. Okay, so I think that's it for this set of slides, and Eli will take over from here and just continue. Thanks, Eli.
Okay, am I on here? Great. So I just want to reiterate, it is a blessing to be here, and a blessing to see the interest in what's going on here in this church, and the interest in biblical principles on managing money God's way. I also want to recognize the people online. I don't know how many there are. Could be 20, 30 or more. We're thankful and we're blessed that we have the technology to do that. Just a quick public service announcement. From time to time in these sort of seminars and these settings, we do get some comments and questions that are a little bit more of a private nature, and we sort of encourage that maybe to be held back. Tony and I are definitely available to ask, to discuss and answer questions during the break or after. So just things of that nature, maybe just best left to later. The other thing I want to mention, do have some good news and bad news. The good news is what Tony just laid out here in sort of slides, in the first 6 comparisons, the secular person versus the biblical steward. He's really laid the foundation for all you need. Maybe it sounds like, okay, we're just cutting a lot of stuff out, but that's really all you need. He's laid the foundation, contentment, humility. If you can just pray and ask God to enable him to allow you to be more content, to be more humble, that's the key, really. It doesn't really get more complicated than that. So there you go, good news, we're done, we can all go home, beat the snow out of here, right? I know, I'm just kidding. The bad news is you gotta hang around for another 4 or 5 hours. But I will tell you, there's a lot of material, there's a lot of slides. We will likely focus a little more on some slides versus some others. At least I will probably doing that. This one here, so we carry on number 7. This is critical now. So I want you to think about this: the secular person versus the biblical steward. Okay, so number 7 here, we're looking at the secular person uses money to buy things that are temporary. He is short-sighted, as his investments are treasures on earth. Okay, so we mentioned that the keys are contentment and humility. Those are critical. But there's one other factor, a third factor that is needed before you can attain those two that God wants you to have. And that is an eternal perspective. And we need to think about this. I recently heard a Bible study, and it was excellent. It's not part of the slides, but I do want to share it, that really spoke to me and helped me understand the perspective, the different perspectives on possessions. And really what does God want? And, because when we really think about it, when we go through these lessons, one of the key principles is the way we manage money impacts our relationship with God. That is very true. But it works the other way too. Our relationship with God impacts the way we manage money. So I want to take a couple minutes and look at the story of the Good Samaritan, because I think this was an excellent Bible study, and it's not something I came up with. It was a pastor in California. I forget his name. Might be John Maxwell. I just can't remember his name. A pastor of a large church in California. He just presented an excellent, fairly quick study on the story of the Good Samaritan, which I want to show you. So just bear with me here. So we're looking at Luke. Hopefully everybody can see that. Luke 10. The story of the Good Samaritan starts at verse 30. And Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." Okay, so why do we want to bring up the story of the Good Samaritan? The story of the Good Samaritan really shows the different perspectives on possessions. Okay, the first, and we'll go from one extreme to the other. So the first perspective is, it's very simple. What's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. What's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. And that is, that's an extreme example. It represents, the lowest percentage of people around. Probably the lowest perspective, but it's an extreme example, but it does exist, and we have that in society, unfortunately. What's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. The second perspective on possessions, what's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. What's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. And that, I would venture to say, is likely describes the majority of people. It's difficult for us to let go. It's just difficult for us to let go. We might want to, we try to, but it's difficult, and we're just in that camp there. The third perspective is, what's mine is yours, and I'm going to share it. So you see there, we had, the 3 different characters of the story: the robbers, or the robbers. Okay, the priest and the Levite, they would fall in the second category, and the third is a Samaritan. Okay, what's mine is yours. I'm going to share it. Okay, but there is a final perspective, which it's not explicitly addressed in here, but Tony did touch on it. It's indicated in Psalm 24. And this is with the other extreme, right? So the final perspective on the other end of the spectrum is, what's mine really isn't mine, and I'm going to steward it. What's mine really isn't mine, I'm going to steward it. And what I'd encourage is, I think a lot of us, and definitely myself included, we're sort of this tension between perspective 2 and 3. I want to give more, I want to share more, but I don't know, I might need this. It's tough to give up more of my money, my time, and resources. We're kind of just in that, we're pulled between 2 and 3, and we want to go from 2 to 3, but it's tough. That might describe some of us, right? But what I would say and encourage you is, if you're having a tough time doing that, focus on the highest perspective. Perspective number 4 is that, our very lives, our breath, our ability to earn income, our ability to have possessions, all come from the Lord himself. Now, the way we do that is to have a truly eternal perspective. Okay, so we look at Matthew, 6 there, 19:21. Jesus is encouraging us, do not focus on treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. This isn't a command, but this is what Jesus is telling us is the best way. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Okay? And then alternatively in 1 Timothy, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, okay? So it really comes down to, can we recognize the reason and the purpose that God has us here? Is it to acquire things that are temporary and won't last? You think about the cell phones you buy. How long do they last, right? You're lucky maybe if they last 3 years, the battery dies. So just think about that. I'd encourage you, this is a slide, this is a key slide. I know I spent a lot of time on it, but this is just something, it's foundational, right? So we're gonna get back to this, but it's eternal perspective that'll enable us to be humble, and that will enable us to be content. And then we move from the spiritual down to the practical. But you can't just start with the practical, it doesn't work. Okay, and then we got the next one, the secular person believes that financial success arises out of his hard work. He made it happen. Deuteronomy 8, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me, but remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. So these are things we ought to remember. These are important points. These are not things we ought to overlook. Okay, especially, if we have that biblical worldview, how we got here, how we came to being, how is it that we were able to attain a good education and a good job? Let's go back to this. These are like first principles, right? Wealth, First Chronicles, wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and give strength to all. Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name on the right there. Yeah, the next one or two, I'll just kind of get by a little quick here. Secular person looks for opportunities to make a lot of money, wants to get rich quick. So it's everything we can go back to what's foundational, right? This is a very earthly perspective. Let's just get rich quickly, acquire things quickly. But do we stop and think how temporary these things are, right? So the biblical steward does not try to get rich quick, but works faithfully wherever God has directed. Okay? I'm not going to read every verse, but I think these are excellent. You have these in your handouts. These are just excellent references to go back and look at. You can just do several Bible studies that are just looking at these biblical references. Number 10. Okay, so wants to keep up with the Joneses. Okay? Wants to keep up with the Joneses. We're getting, we're back to that issue of contentment. You're going to see a lot of this stuff we repeat because it's extremely crucial. And we see in Exodus 20, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, or his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Okay, and then Paul addresses contentment in Philippians, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. So Paul went through various different things, various different challenges in his life. He was, in the early time, he was persecuting Christians, then he was suffering later, didn't have much. He gave up a lot to share the name of Christ, to spread the gospel. And this is what he said: I can do everything through him who gives me strength. Okay, so that can be like a model of contentment, but how do we get there? That's the key. Yeah, this here, this is interesting, but one comment I'll make here is, the secular person generally either spoils or neglects family. And I don't know if a lot of us spend time looking at Ecclesiastes, but you can get some really interesting nuggets from here. It's certainly, and I'm glad Tom has this in here. Ecclesiastes 5, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. If you think about it, like our lives here in 2022, we can be very, very busy doing nothing. If we think about this honestly, right, we can be very, very busy. We could fill up our lives really accomplishing nothing. And what I mean by nothing, I mean nothing of real significant value to the Lord. There's just a lot of stuff that can take our time, consume our time and energy, our resources, okay? And we can, and you think about it too, we can spend a lot of time working and focusing on acquiring things, okay? And if we just fall into that mindset, we need to have more. We need to constantly upgrade our cell phones, or we need to, get that better car, or get a bigger house, every, maybe 10 years, or we just need something better, bigger, better, constantly every so often, right? If that's the mindset, right? You might be kind of falling into this trap of just spending a lot of time on things that really don't matter to God. So it's just important to think about these things. The biblical steward, on the other hand, provides for the needs of family. Okay? If anyone, 1 Timothy 5:8, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So this is the focus. So this is, we just get a good sense of what God sees as important and what God does not see as important. That's why I love these comparisons here. So just lastly, I'm going to wrap up here on this section. Just a nice, concise summary. The secular person has the traits of pride, greed, fear, dishonesty, selfishness, covetousness. Those can be big things. They definitely played a part in my life, and I find I have to actively ask the Lord to help me deal with those issues. Right? They won't just naturally go away. Trust in self, loves money, unrighteous, frustrated. I even throw in the word stress. If one or more of these traits on the left side can dominate our ways of thinking in our lives, it's very easy for stress to set in. Okay, that can definitely happen. So the biblical steward, on the other hand, we look at the character traits of humility, generosity, faithfulness, honesty, contentment. The key there, one of the keys, loves the Lord, righteous, peaceful, and trusts God. Okay, so that's sort of the summary. The secular person versus the biblical steward. This is really, like I said, foundational. So we want to spend some time going through those comparisons. We think it's important, and we will come back to, I believe, we need to come back to these key foundational points and try to really drive them home. It's not to be repetitive and redundant, but it is, we're trying to change the way we think. That's the whole goal of this. So I'm going to leave it there, and I think Tony now will carry on with the first case study.
Thanks, Eli. Okay, we're just going to get into our first case study, and I'll just read it for us, and then we'll just go through a few of the questions and try and apply some of these, some of these principles that we've been discussing. So, Christian friends Bill and Steve are interested in investing. It is not a full-time occupation for either of them, but has become somewhat of a hobby for both. Bill spends a lot of time studying what God's Word says on investing and finances in general. He prays and asks God to provide wisdom and direction to manage and invest the money that God has entrusted to him. Steve, on the other hand, relies upon comments and advice of well-known investment and financial experts who appear in the media. Steve thinks the Bible is academic and has little to do with investing in finances, and that God is really not interested in this area. Both Bill and Steve deal through brokers, but handle the downturns in the markets very differently. Bill meditates on verses such as Matthew 6:31-33 and Proverbs 3:5 and 6, which reassure him that God will provide for his needs, notwithstanding market conditions. Steve, however, gets upset, has sleepless nights, and frequently gets angry with his broker when he sees the value of his portfolio decrease significantly. So Bill's investment strategy is to apply God's investment principles and trust God. Over the long run, he realizes a 5 to 7% annual return on his investments. Steve spends a lot more personal time and energy than Bill because Steve wants to be part of the smart money, which earns exceptionally high rates of return each year and over the long run. When Bill's portfolio does exceptionally well, he says very little to his colleagues and friends, but thanks God for the blessings. Steve says that it is appropriate to tell his colleagues and friends about his successes so they can make a lot of money as well, like he plans to. It makes Steve feel good when he tells others about his winners. However, he becomes very uncomfortable when anyone asks him about his bad investments. Okay, so the first question we'd just like to look at is, in what ways has Bill acted like a biblical steward? And if you can, provide a reference to Scripture, but you don't have to. Does anybody have any thoughts? If you'd like to come up to the mic here, and if you have any thoughts or with respect to, what ways Bill has acted like a biblical steward, you can look back on some of the comparisons that we just kind of touched on. Don't be shy. Okay. Just for sake of time, I'll just move it along. There's a number of them. So one, Bill acknowledges that God's ownership of his investments, right? That was key, the whole stewardship principle. Bill has also learned God's investment principles. I mean, we didn't touch on that just yet, but generally speaking, you want to be able to diversify your investments and really not get into something that you're really not comfortable with or familiar with. So, for example, Eli is a lot more comfortable and educated in investing in the stock market than I am. He's probably, again, would make more sense for him to invest more of his money there than someone like myself, whereas I'm possibly a little more comfortable in the real estate game. But whatever it is you invest your money in, make sure that you have a sound understanding. Don't just rely on what other people tell you. That's just a general kind of guideline. Bill applies God's principles and trusts God for the results. And Bill is content with reasonable return on his investments. And again, contentment is huge. Bill is humble. He does not boast about his winners, but simply thanks the Lord when his investments do well. And Bill enjoys God's peace during the downturns. And that's hard to do. That's really difficult to do. When people are losing, I don't know if everybody remembers back in 2008 when we had that kind of world economic downturn. Some people were losing upwards of 40 to 50% of their investment portfolios in a very short period of time. And it's, if you don't have God's peace through those times, it's just very, very difficult. And I can just say that, Eli touched on the stress that comes along with, not following a lot of these making decisions outside of these biblical principles. I've seen it firsthand. We try to help, coach a number of people who are struggling financially. And you can see the strain that it puts on people. I mean, financial stress is horrible. I mean, it affects not only can affect your physical health, your mental health, and your spiritual health. And it can unfortunately, ruin families. It's a terrible thing. And unfortunately, a lot of people today are struggling with serious financial issues because of the state of, the climate of our economic climate right now with rising interest rates and the rising standard of living. So again, we stress contentment a lot, but it is very important because contentment helps us to learn to live within our means. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, right? But we need to learn to live within our means if we're going to reap the benefits in the long run. We can't have everything we want now. That's something we have to really accept. And I don't know if there's any music fans here, but I'm a big music fan. The Rolling Stones got it right. You can't always get what you want, right? But if you try, sometimes you get what you need, and that's what's important. And that's what we need to focus on. We have to get this mindset of wants and desires all the time out of our head, because that's how we get into problems, because generally people fund their wants and desires through debt. And when you accumulate debt over a long period of time, you're gonna have to pay for it at some point, right? And we're gonna get more into that later when we talk about budgeting and steps to get out of debt. So number 6, Bill enjoys God's peace during the downturn. So again, that comes back to contentment. Number 7, Bill seeks counsel from God and not from worldly experts. Seek God's counsel. Okay. Second question. So in what ways has Steve acted like a secular person? And again, where possible, provide scripture. If anybody has any thoughts on that, since I gave you the answer to the first question. How has Steve acted like a secular person? I think there's a lot of examples in the comparisons that we provided. Anybody? No?
He's got that get-rich-quick mindset.
Right? Yep, absolutely.
Bragging about his wealth, and how quickly he got it.
Yep.
He only celebrates his wins and doesn't share his losses.
Right.
So it just shows he wants to make himself look good.
Yeah.
And he trusts in himself and people around him for the knowledge.
Yep. And that's common, right? I mean, in our society, it is really common, and there's nothing wrong with getting other people's opinions. There are some, you can get some wise counsel out there, but I think we need to get into the habit of first going to the Lord. That's the key, right? Instead of, I think what a lot of us do, and I've been guilty of this, is we kind of lay out plans of what we want to do, purchasing something, whatever it might be, and then we ask the Lord to bless our plans, right? Instead of going to the Lord first for guidance and direction.
Tony.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment on that. There is no shortage of financial market experts, really smart people out there in the investing world, smart economists. I worked at just a side point. I worked at the Bank of Canada for a year shortly after university. Some of the, I would say some of the smartest people in the country working there. But I just want to give you, put these things, we talk about perspective again. Like the Bank of Canada, I would say, was late for whatever reason. They thought this inflation problem our country is experiencing was sort of temporary, and they called it transitory, and they were late to start raising interest rates and trying to cure or slow down inflation. They kept talking about that late last year. And then I would say market experts, stock market experts, many of them, most of them were wrong in 2000, wrong in 2007, 2008, and had no clue what was happening, obviously, with the pandemic in 2020. Point being on all this stuff is smart people, wherever they are, economists and market experts and commentators, will certainly get things wrong. Only God knows the future. Only God has perfect knowledge of future events. So to rely on experts can be, maybe a little bit helpful, but they should certainly not be over-relied upon. Only God, we can't stress this enough, only God really knows the future. We're not really doing investing. That's a big, big topic within financial management God's way. But I would say just keep that in mind. If you're somebody that's into investing, trying to grow your savings and portfolio and relying on different things you're seeing in the media, keep that in mind. A lot of smart people get a lot of things wrong all the time in many different scenarios. Only God really knows what's going on. Just want to throw that in there.
Thanks, Eli. So I think we've covered most of them. I'll just, for the sake of time, bring them up. So Steve acts like an owner, not a steward. He also relies upon worldly financial experts, which was mentioned. He has great fear of losing money during the downturns and does not trust God to provide. He also boasts about his successful investments, but never really talks about his losses, right? He believes that he can figure out how to invest successfully on his own without God's help. Okay, so I think we're going to probably skip the rest of these, Eli, and move on to the next session just for the sake of time. I think we've covered a lot of this. Yeah, you would bring up the next slide here. Okay.
Okay, so we'll move on to our next session. Bear with me here. Okay, so yeah, we really just want to reiterate, we really appreciate any comments and questions anybody has. We'll obviously do our best to answer whatever we can, but just in general, it just makes these seminars a lot more practical and I think helpful for everybody. If somebody has a question, it's quite likely it's on the minds of many other people, and we just find it helpful. The little more interactive this can get, the better, as opposed to just Tony and I hitting you over the head with all these different principles, which we're happy to do, but we like when we can have a little more of a dialogue and interaction. So feel free, as you've been doing, just you don't need to come up front, but just ask something and we can repeat it for those on the live stream. So financial deceptions, this is important. This is important to, I'm kind of going to frame this as we're trying to build awareness. Okay, so, there's the spiritual. We want to be spiritually aware of our own hearts and our own minds. And, we went through the comparisons, secular person versus a biblical steward, and what drives those different characteristics, those character traits. Many of that could, those factors could be driven by spiritual problems. But we want to be, I'd say awareness and understanding are really key. And it's good to just be aware of different sentiments, different attitudes, different theories and philosophies on how we ought to live that are just floating around out there. We have no shortage of information these days, with social media, obviously, a huge thing, but media in general and the internet. Okay, so, we need to understand, we are bombarded with all kinds of false concepts with regard to finances. We, as Tom writing about, we call these financial deceptions, quote unquote. Financial deceptions are beliefs that appear to be correct, but are contrary to God's principles and often tempt people to get into debt. Okay, so you're in this church and seems like, especially a lot of leaders, you've incurred no new debt, which is great at the church level, and we understand there's a lot of interest in this area, and that we're really encouraged by that. But the reality is, we don't live in this bubble. We live in a world where we're just bombarded with lots of stuff, and it's very easy to fall into these traps and temptations we kind of hear, right? So that's why we like doing stuff like this. We're trying to train our minds, our ways of thinking, to get out of those mindsets that can inadvertently be developed over time. Okay? So there's a question. Maybe requires a quick answer, but do you think living paycheck to paycheck is common? Do you think it's common? Like, when I say common, do you think more than half the people here do this in the province, in the country? Any thoughts? Yes? Okay, good. So this might be, I'm not sure, a little bit outdated. I'm not sure when this, I'm going to show you something else, but this is what Tom has come across over the years. Stats reveal that 80 to 90% of people live paycheck to paycheck. That is, you're basically your regular net income. You get, let's say you get paid once a week, twice a month, once every 2 weeks, whatever. You basically everything that comes in your bank account, it's gone within a week or two to pay all your bills. That's pretty much it, I would say. There's no savings or funds being held back beyond what you need to spend for a given month, right? We all have monthly expenses. So that's how I would look at that. And I'll show you a chart in a second. But if we think about this, right, first the reference from the Bible, God says, the wise man saves for the future, but the foolish man spends whatever he gets. So we're not, I just want to make this clear. We're not in the business of, criticizing or anything. It's more like warning and developing understanding and awareness of what's going on, right? And we just want to reveal, if you look at this 80 to 90%, if we just look at this logically, and like I said, I'm going to show you a chart in a minute, but if you look at this logically, if we take these statistics to be true, that's including everybody. So that probably includes the wealthier, the relatively wealthier. If you probably remove those from the analysis, from the calculation, I would venture to say statistics reveal closer to 90% of sort of middle class, whatever we call middle class income earners or middle class household income earners live paycheck to paycheck. It's quite high. And what I want to show you here, now, if you don't believe this necessarily, what I want to show you is this here. Okay, so this is Bank of Canada. My apologies, I don't want to show that. I want to show this. A little hard to see, but the point being here, so we go back to about 1996, so we'll call it about 2.5 decades. This is this red line represents the savings rate in Canada. These are statistics compiled by the Bank of Canada. So how much of household income has been saved, so not spent on a monthly basis. Okay, so this is the data by the Bank of Canada, and if you look at here, it's quite high percentage going back into the 80s, but if you look here, let's look at, last 2.5 decades or so. It generally trended between 0 and 5%. That's the average in Canada. Average household saves between 0 and 5% of their income. Now you say, well, what's this? This is sort of the pandemic. Just started shooting up. People had nowhere to go, nothing to do, nowhere to spend their money. That shot up, and it's coming back down real quick. I don't have updated numbers. But the point being that if this is the trend, right? If this is the trend generally for the last 2.5 decades, I hate to say it, but 0 to 5% is not going to cut it. I used to work my older job. I was making a lot of money, but I wasn't in there. I was spending too much, and I actually had to come to realization that I need to make savings more of a priority. I remember reading a book by a Canadian financial planner. And my eyes really, it was a really eye-opening thing. He mentioned, to properly save for future needs, retirement needs, you need to save 15% of your income, gross income. And I'm like, whoa, yes, gross, he said. He actually repeated that. So full disclosure, I'm not at 15%. I'm trying really hard to get there. And that can be tough for a lot of people. But the point being that being in the sort of 0 to 5, I would encourage you just to take a hard look at what your priorities are and where your money's going. We're going to talk about budgeting. And I say this because, we don't want to be in a situation where we have to work, until we're 70 or 80 or something where it becomes difficult. If we're faced with an illness and work and employment becomes difficult as we age, these are things we want to think about much sooner, right? And we don't want to be forced into doing that. We need to understand there's a lot of costs that will need to be met as we age and get older, and meeting retirement costs can be challenging if we don't have a plan, if we don't have a proper plan and a way to do that when we're in our 20s, 30s, and 40s. So that's sort of longer-term thinking, longer-term financial planning, and longer-term savings goals. But we have other things we have to worry about right now, like my car's going to, need to be replaced in 5 years. I'm going to need to work on the roof in 5 years, right? These are all very, very good and important reasons to make savings a very high priority, right? So we'll get back to this. So I just wanted to show you that. I just want to encourage you, if savings is not a priority, to think about that and try to make it more of a priority. I promise you will find it very helpful. God warns us, and we're going to see that, and there's a few things we need to consider here. Most people, unfortunately, fall into the foolish category, okay? And these are the things, and we get into more of the practical, right? And I'm certainly guilty of this, right? We don't anticipate non-monthly expenses all the time, okay? Property taxes, annual insurance premiums, automobile replacement. But we might anticipate those. The ones that get more challenging are normal, unexpected expenditures. Okay, stuff comes up on a car, kind of out of nowhere. Like I picked up my daughter, she goes to York University. I was driving from Oakville, picked her up from York University, which is around Keele and Steeles, and drove back home to Whitby. And the drive was fine. This was on Monday night. Got home, parked in the driveway, let her out, and I was just stopped the car for a minute, and then I was just going to put it in the garage. I tried, turning it on about 4 or 5 times, wouldn't start, and called CAA. Oh, you need a new battery, the last thing on my mind, right? So, okay, $200 out the door, right? Like, there's just things that are just going to come up, right? And the thing is, you don't know. This is like a saying: you don't know what you don't know, right? Like, you want to anticipate as much as possible, but you just don't always know what might come up. And you have a car, you have a house. Those are 2 areas where they sometimes require huge, unexpected expenditures, right? So we need to just keep that in mind, right? Sometimes stuff comes up that's just even more out of left field. And if you just don't have an emergency fund, so we're going from more anticipated down the list to less anticipated or completely unanticipated. If you have like no emergency fund to cover some things, or, the odds are one of us here, at least one of us, is going to lose their job at some point or another. I hate to say it, I did. I was out of work for 5 months, right? Stuff like this, we don't like to think about and we don't like to plan for and anticipate, but they can happen, unfortunately, right? I hate to say it. So this is why savings becomes so crucial here. And then obviously number 4, the longer term needs, like we talked about, retirement and children's education. So just kind of wrapping up the first deception, Jesus recommends that you save for future needs. This is the parable of the tower, or the verse about building a tower. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? For if he lays the foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, "This fellow began to build and was not able to finish." So Christ is admonishing us to, do a couple of things. Count the cost. I think he was talking about being a disciple, but it was really important. He was stressing to count the cost, but also in doing so, we need to plan ahead. Planning ahead, counting the cost, trying to anticipate as much as possible is biblical. So paycheck, summary paycheck to paycheck is not really in line with doing this, is not in line and consistent with God's word. His admonition is that we should plan ahead and save for future needs. Okay, so get to number 2, financial deception number 2. Debt restructuring will solve your financial problems. This is a pretty good one. And I understand the rationale for this. On the surface, I understand this. So, common steps used to deal with excess debt. A lot of people do this. Let's be honest, a lot of people do this. Common steps would be personal lines of credit to pay off credit cards, so you get that interest rate down from the high teens, perhaps, down to below 10%, or something like that. Second mortgage on a home, or potentially withdrawing money from a retirement plan. I've seen that in my practice as well, unfortunately. So, yes, it is true, debt restructuring can lower interest costs, but it does not deal with the underlying problem. That's what we're trying to impress upon you today, the underlying problem. Spending more than one is earning. And why is that happening? Okay, and so I want to dig into this one a bit here. I've got a few minutes, I think. This is important. So, common reasons for spending more than you earn over a long period of time. Okay, point number 1, lack of knowledge. God admonishes us, Proverbs 24, 3-4. By wisdom, a house is built, and through understanding, it is established. Through knowledge, its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures. Okay, so when I think about this, I think of the idea, we need to be aware. It's really important to be aware of two things. What is going on in the world? 3 things. Okay, what does the Bible have to say about money and material things and our attitude towards money and material things? But also, a couple other things. What is the world telling us? How logical is that? And what are we, and being ultimately aware of what we are doing? This is huge. We need to be aware of what we're doing. And this is just something I came up with. This is more of a personal thing. You might find it helpful, you might not. I'm hoping you might. I'd like to use 5 simple words that help me on the path of examining what I'm doing. Okay, what I'm doing relating to the decisions I'm making on that are going to affect my financial situation And it can be, you might think that, there's a lot of insignificant decisions I make, like, I'm going to buy a coffee from Starbucks and it's $3, right? But every little decision counts, right? So the 5 words I use are, why do I need that? You just ask yourself that, 5 little words. Why do I need that? Now, let me be very clear. I'm not, and Tony's the same, we're not here to tell you what you ought to need and what you ought not to need. The point I want to get across is, I'm not sure most people are asking themselves this question. Just ask yourself the question. I think if we do that more and more, we will get to the root of any problems that are holding us back in the area of managing money God's way. Why do I need that? Now, why do I need that? Now, there might be, and I'm being very sincere, there might be very good reasons to have more expensive things. I'm not here to comment or criticize on that. There might be very good reasons, but I'm just imploring you to ask yourself the question. Why do I need that? It can be simple. Why do I need to go to Starbucks? It can be bigger. Why do I need this type of luxury car, or whatever, anything in between, right? Why do I need that? I don't think most people want to do that. It may not be a pleasant question to ask yourself, but I would suggest that it is a very good question to ask yourself. And I firmly believe the better questions we ask, the better answers we will get. Now, the answer to the question, why do I need that, quite honestly, it could, if it begins or ends or somehow relates to other people and external things and what you've heard on the media, social media, and peers and friends and work, that's probably not a very good reason. And it's probably not God telling you that it's a good idea to have this. But the point being is we want to be aware of what we're doing and why we are doing it. Why do I need to buy this item? Why do I need this model of cell phone? Just simply ask the question. That's all. We're not saying you should or should not have this or need it, but it's important to break down. We want to break down needs versus wants. I find that's an excellent question. Then we move from the more practical down to the spiritual. Lack of discipline. So lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, number 1. So asking yourself that question can help with that. Number 2, lack of discipline. Number 3, unwillingness to sacrifice. Now we're getting more down to the spiritual. Again, we have some references, Proverbs 13, Luke 9. And then ultimately, the problem might be an ungodly attitude or mindset. And then we lead back to what we saw there in the first session there. Okay, so sometimes the root cause of financial problems goes beyond the financial into the spiritual. Okay, so some of these problems, like we reiterate, they're covetousness, lack of contentment, greed, selfishness, pride. Okay, so worldly attitudes, mindsets that result in ungodly thinking. So we need to, if those are something you're dealing with, then it's best to take that to the Lord. For me, covetousness and pride were and still are sometimes issues that I need to take to the Lord. We just don't assume they'll just go away automatically, right? And this is the whole idea, right? Like we're talking about, the idea is to train ourselves to think differently, right? That's what we are really hoping, that's our prayer, is that we will be able to think differently. That's the goal. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And how do you change the way you think? Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. It's Joshua 1:8. Okay. So here, I got a couple more slides. Yeah, so, financial deception number 3, I actually made some comments that that relate to this, so I'm not going to repeat that, but this is a lie. The only way that is true is if you can predict the future, know the directions of the market and the economy. So like I said before, really only God knows what's going to happen in the world. We like to make our best efforts to if we're investing, to anticipate what's going on, or the market's going to rebound. It's been a tough year this year. Only God knows. Are we going to get another downturn, right? A lot of expert opinions out there, but only God knows. Just keep that in mind. In Proverbs 27:1, this is often helpful. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. Okay, so there's just no sure things out there. There's no guarantees. No sure deals. Excuse me. So, Deuteronomy 28, we're just talking about the idea of using minimal debt or no debt, and this is encouraged throughout Scripture. In the Old Testament there, God promised His people that if they fully obeyed Him, they would be lenders, not borrowers. So in the Bible, debt was considered to be a curse, not a blessing. And even today, debt is usually a curse or a burden, not a blessing. You think about, your church or other churches, what countries are going through. Debt is not a blessing. Like, people like to use it, but it is really not, ultimately not a blessing. Countries that incur too much debt will eventually have to tax to pay off that debt. Okay, they're going to run into problems. So it's not a sin. We just want to make it clear. It's not a sin to borrow. It is a sin to borrow, not repay. That's mentioned in Psalms. But God's warning of the dangers of debt all throughout Scripture, Proverbs 22:7 is an example. God instructs us to put Him first and trust Him, not the bank, to meet our needs. Okay. So, just last couple points. Excuse me. During difficult times, those who use debt can suffer the most. Difficult times, if you have a lot of debt and you lose your job, that's not a great situation to be in, right? We want to avoid that. Unfortunately, your mortgage payments aren't going to stop necessarily until you get a new job, right? So smart people do not use other people's money, but rather smart people borrow as little as possible and pay it off as soon as possible. I'm going to, just as a point, final point, I'll later on, when we talk a little bit about mortgages and mortgage payments, I'm going to try to make this a little more practical and share a couple of numbers with you to illustrate the point better. I'm going to save that for a little bit later, so stay tuned. We don't want to just make this all theoretical, and I want to show you some numbers as to why paying down debt sooner than later makes a ton of sense. Okay, so just another question here, and then I'm going to hand it off to Tony. How does the world define financial freedom? How does the world define financial freedom? And how does God define financial freedom? If there's any thoughts out there, you can share them. Otherwise, we will get into that shortly.
The world says get what you want, God says get what you need.
Excellent. I like that. Get what you want versus get what you need. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Any comments? Just shout them out. You don't have to come up to the mic. That's fine. But that's great.
Yes, financial freedom is not living paycheck to paycheck. I don't need
Yeah.
$500 left over. If I have 50 or 25, that's financial freedom to me.
Okay.
Ideally,
Yeah.
500 would be nice,
Yep.
but it doesn't have to be 500.
No, it doesn't have to. I mean, everybody's situation is different, right? And I think the main thing is you want to have a surplus. at the end of each month. That's the key, right? And that's what we're going to talk about in the budgeting session. And because think about it, for many people at some time in our lives, we're gonna have to deal with debt, some form or another, right? Whether you purchase a home and you have a mortgage, or you have other forms of debt. It's very difficult to pay down debt if you don't have a surplus of cash every month, right? If you don't factor that into your monthly budget or cash flow. So yeah, it's different in every situation, but generally speaking, you're right, 500 is better than 50, right? Because then you can use those funds to either pay down debt or invest it, to earn a return on your investment. But that's a good point. Yeah. Anybody else? That's good. Okay. Okay, so the fourth financial deception is financial freedom is attained by having a lot of money, right? There are many wealthy people that don't have peace in the area of finances, and they're not financially free. Now, there's nothing wrong with making a lot of money. I just want to be clear. Like I've known some people that they're just blessed with the ability to generate a very good income, whatever they might do, whether it's running a business or it might be in their careers. And they were actually Christians, right? So they're just blessed with that. But I think what it comes down to is our attitude towards money. Because I think what's happened in our culture today is, people think that you have financial freedom by just having a lot of money, but how much is enough, right? It's like when is enough? It's always a moving target. So it's difficult to really, find peace or contentment with having that attitude, especially in the culture today. Things are much different today than they were 50 years ago. There's a lot more temptation in our culture today. I think, that's fair to say. I mean, just look at social media. Better yet, don't look at social media, right? So, many, unfortunately, like I said, become obsessed with making money, and they make making money their god, right? It's money, it's one thing or another. If it's not God, it's generally something else that we worship. And in our culture today, there's many people that are just obsessed with making more money. And, again, just going back to the music theme, I read a lot of biographies of very famous, successful musicians like, McCartney, and I'm probably dating myself now, but like Elton John and those types of people. And there's a common theme that goes through these, the lives of these people. And they've been, ridiculously successful, made more money than they could ever imagine. And all of them are miserable at the height of their success. All of them except a few. And one of them was, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Bono from U2. He's a Christian. And he says the one thing that saved him from the temptations of the music industry is his faith. It's given him perspective. Whereas you see what happens with a lot of other, and it's not just in the music industry, it's across, any industry, right? You lose perspective, right? When you have so much money, because really money does become your God. And if you're not grounded and have the right attitude towards money, it can ruin your life. And we see what happens to a lot of people. They turn to drugs, or they turn to alcohol, or they turn to other things. So we really need to understand that, yes, nothing wrong with making money. We want to work hard. We want to, we want to have a sense of purpose in what we do in life, but we want to just make sure that we have the right attitude towards the money we make. And I always tell, my son's applying to university and stuff now, and he tells me, like, these kids now look up they can look up careers and how much money you can make in all these different careers. And I try to tell him, look, it's not about how much money you make, it's what you do with the money you make, right? Because money can be gone in a flash, right? As we know what happens in the stock markets and other forms of investments that can happen in the real estate market as well. So again, the key here is that we want to just understand what God's will is, right, in the area of our finances. And again, we all have different financial challenges and situations, but we just want to make sure that we understand God's will and we walk in God's will when we're managing the money that He has entrusted to us. And then we'll have a sense of peace. Again, it's not how much money we make, it's what we do with it. Yeah. Okay, so we kind of covered this. Suggestion again, contentment, which we talked about earlier, so I won't hit you over the head with that again. We want to acknowledge that the accumulation of money, material things is temporary. Eli, I think, touched on that earlier as well, and not of any real eternal value. And other thing we want to keep in mind is the joy of giving, which we touched on earlier as well. These are things that we want to keep in mind, and also that we're stewards of the money that the Lord has entrusted to us. Sorry, I'm going through these slides quickly. I just want to be mindful of the time. Because this next deception, I think, is really important. I want to spend a little more time on this, right? So it makes sense to buy now and pay later. And this is really reflective of the culture today, right? If you think back, I think back to like my parents' generation, even 50 years ago. The majority of people, not all, but the majority of people only borrowed money if they had to purchase a home, right? Come up with your down payment and you have your mortgage. Today, it's gone the other way, right? We can borrow money for virtually anything. Again, back 40, 50 years ago, if you had to purchase a car, you saved your money, and when you had enough money, you purchased your car, whether it was a new car or a used car. If you had to purchase a major appliance, again, you saved your money, and you purchased it when you had the money. And if something broke down like your furnace, people generally had savings, and they could just pay it off. They didn't put it on credit cards back then, right? Today, like I said, you can borrow for virtually anything, right? Most people have financing for their vehicles. Any major appliances you can get financing for. And if you can't get financing from a vendor or whatever, you can just use your credit cards, of course, right? And let's talk a little bit about credit cards, okay? I hope most of you know that the interest rate on credit cards is anywhere between 20 and 30%, all right? Like this is, as far as I'm concerned, it's legalized loan sharking. And it's ruined a lot of people's lives. It really has. When you think about it, we have been, historically speaking, in low interest rate environment for at least 5 years, if not longer, right? I think back to when I purchased my first home, like over 20 years ago, okay? We had an interest rate of 8.5%, and we thought that was very reasonable, right? Well, just before these recent hikes that we've had, like people were paying between 1.5% to like 3% on their mortgages. Like there was nowhere else for it to go but up, right? Type thing. But the point I'm trying to make is that we're in very, when you look at the interest rate that we pay on mortgages, even today, they've gone up, so 5-6%, okay? And mortgages are secured by the asset, which is the home. So generally speaking, interest rates that are secured by something have lower interest rates, and that's fine. Credit cards are not secured. But for them to be able to charge 20 to 30%, like I said, it's ridiculous. And what happens is a lot of people don't realize they're paying that much. So if you don't pay off your credit cards every month, what ends up happening is you're just paying the interest every month is what you're doing, and you're never paying down that principal. And just going back to, I used to work in the banking industry quite some time ago, and I saw this happen over and over again. Many people, again, they would just use their credit card essentially to buy things they don't really need, generally wants and desires, put them on their credit cards and just make the minimum monthly payment every month. And they would carry balances throughout the year. I've seen couples, let's say husband and wife, carry close to $80,000 on multiple credit cards. So if you take just a 20% interest rate, right, on the low end on a credit card, right, that's a lot of money, right? If you think about it, you can spend that money somewhere else instead of giving it to these credit card companies. So just look at your, every credit card is different. I'm not knocking the use of them. Use them, that's fine, but use them responsibly. Make sure that you pay them off at the end of every month. Like that's the key. So that's my rant on credit cards. Sorry, that really really gets me, because I've just seen a lot of people, unfortunately, really, fall into really financial difficulty because of it, and it's hard to get out. And Eli made a good point earlier. Debt restructuring can help you, address that issue, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, right? Because many people do take advantage of the equity in their homes, which is a very good thing, right? And most people's homes have increased over the value of their homes have increased over the past 10, 15 years here in Ontario, which is great, but you don't want to fall into the temptation of pulling the equity out of your house and then just spending it on, you want to pay down your debts, that's great, but what a lot of people have done is they pulled the equity out of their homes because the banks will lend you a percentage based on the equity that you have, based on your level of income. But what happens is a lot of people end up going and spend that money on taking expensive vacations and racking up more debt. So when you started off with a mortgage of, say, $200,000, right? People go and either refinance their mortgage or get a home equity line of credit, and they spend it on a lot of these wants and desires. The next thing you know, you have a mortgage of $500,000 10 years down the line, because it's easy to spend a lot of money, right? That way. And this is how many people have gotten into serious financial difficulties. So we want to get into the mindset, and it might sound archaic, but what people did 50 years ago, start saving for what we need. Don't just go out there and buy whatever we want on a whim. The way I like to look at it is, look, if we're going to get into the habit of constantly buying whatever we want on debt, on credit, right, borrowing, and just paying for it down the line with interest, yes, we're going to get short-term pleasure, short-term satisfaction, because we're getting whatever it is we want. We're getting it now, right? But make no mistake, we're going to pay for it down the line at some point, because there's going to be a lot of stress, anxiety, right? Physical, mental stress, you name it. It's coming. Like, it will catch up to us, especially if we use credit cards the way many people use in our culture today. Alternatively, if we learn to ask ourselves, like Eli said, when we go to make a purchase, do I need this, right? And if you do need it, that's fine. Hopefully you've saved for it. If you haven't, then ask yourself, do I need it now? Because if you don't need it now, then you can wait and save for it. If we get into this mindset of saving for what we need, then we have the cash available for when we need it. Then what happens is we make a short-term sacrifice. Okay, we're not getting what we want right now. Okay, fine. But we're going to have long-term peace and contentment. You're going to be able to sleep at night. Because make no mistake, like, look what's happening, unfortunately, today. Interest rates have gone up significantly over the past number of months. There's a lot of people out there that are sitting on variable mortgages, and their mortgage rates have gone up from like 1.5% up to close to 5%. We were talking about living paycheck to paycheck before, right? That's why you don't want to live paycheck to paycheck, because what happens is your expenses can go up significantly. And if you're just breaking even every month, if there's any blip there, any increase on your monthly expenses, how are you going to pay for it? People are going to, you know what they generally do? Borrow from Peter to pay Paul. They borrow from another, they go and get another credit card or something and use it to pay this other debt. You're never going to get ahead that way. So we want to get into the mindset of saving for what we need, right? And being content with what we have now. Just because somebody else has something, some fancy phone, like, who cares about what everybody else is doing? Run your own race, right? Focus on your journey and don't worry about what anybody else is doing, because that's how, the social media, it's just, I just think it's like a cancer for a lot of this stuff, because I get it. Everybody puts positive stuff up there, like, look what I have, and then other people feel it. It's really bad, I think, for young adults. And we see that, and they kind of get brainwashed by that. They feel like they have to live up to something. And that's why our relationship with the Lord is just so important, right? We need to be grounded, and we need to know what the Lord's will is with respect to, again, how we manage the money and the financial resources that He has entrusted to us. So let's not fall into that trap, into that temptation when, you go out. Ask yourself the question, do I need it? If you don't need it, don't buy it, right? If you do need it and you don't need it right now, save for it, right? There are situations, yes, of course, your furnace breaks down and you don't have the money, fine, put it on your credit card, but make sure you have a plan to pay it back at the end of every month. If there's one thing I would hope everyone would take away from today, just a simple rule: if you have credit cards, pay them off every month. Don't be paying 20 to 30% interest, because it's a hole that can just get very difficult to climb out of if that's how you constantly spend your money. Okay, so God's directive is for us to wait for His provision and His timing, right? If we're content with what the Lord has provided to us, we'll learn to wait for His provision and timing. It doesn't mean that we can't have what we want. It just means we can't have it now in some cases if we don't have the money to afford it, right? That's the key. So we need to learn to be patient. Okay, and I kind of touched on some of these slides, so I'm going to just, I I think we're getting close to our break, and we just have one more financial deception, which is bankruptcy. Okay, bankruptcy is very similar to debt restructuring, right? Bankruptcy does not solve the problem. It doesn't get to the root cause. Okay, it does treat the symptoms, but God's word is clear, right? It does not encourage bankruptcy. The wicked borrow and do not repay, right? But the righteous give generously. And bankruptcy is a bad testimony. Now, I understand there are certain situations where people just have gotten themselves into such a hole and they don't have options. But generally speaking, a lot of trustees in bankruptcy will help people who are struggling and are looking at bankruptcies to come up with a sort of payment arrangements. So, for example, if they'll come up, depending on the financial situation, you might be able to work out a deal where you pay back your secured creditors 60 or 70% of what they're owed. Some of them will agree to it because they know if you go into bankruptcy, they may not get anything, because it depends on a pecking order, right? There's secured creditors and unsecured creditors. But just want to put it out there because I know there are people that are considering possible bankruptcy, but there are options, right? And it doesn't, the key is it doesn't solve the underlying problem. The key is that most people, and this also applies to businesses, it applies to governments. It's not just people. These financial principles applies to everyone, right? If most businesses, people, families get into a difficult financial situation simply because they borrow more money than they can afford to repay. At a grand, in a nutshell is what it is. It's excessive borrowing. Businesses borrow excessively, they presume on the future, they may not get the revenues in, and then they find themselves to pay for those debts. The sales don't materialize as projected, and they get into financial difficulties. So again, a lot of these principles will apply across the board, right? And with respect to bankruptcy, I mean, if you've ever had, there are people who might have had to go into bankruptcy, and Tom just has some suggestions. Just bring it before the Lord, just be honest. The majority of the time people have gone into that situation because they violated biblical principles. The Lord will forgive us, and we just want to ask the Lord for direction moving forward. Let's just get our house in order and start managing, the money that the Lord has entrusted to us in a manner that's consistent with God's will. And we're going to talk about budgeting in the upcoming session, so we'll touch on that when we get to it, because I think it's time for our break right now, and I know some of you probably just want to grab a coffee and maybe use the restroom, okay? Thank you. So maybe just 10 minutes,